The men had already carried her kitchen table out to the wet grass when the motorcycle stopped. She stood on her own front lawn, in a housecoat, 78 years old, watching strangers empty her home, while every neighbor she had known stayed frozen behind their own front doors. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then a man built like a wall of muscle and tattoos swung his leg off a black Harley-Davidson and walked straight toward her, and she braced herself for one more person who wanted something from her. But he asked her one question, the first kind thing anyone had said to her in 8 months, and it would change both of their lives before the sun went down. Ruth Whitfield had lived in the small blue house on Larkspur Lane for 46 years, and she still remembered the exact shade of yellow her husband had painted the porch railing the summer their daughter was born. That yellow was gone now, faded to a tired cream by 4 decades of Ohio winters, but Ruth could still see it when she closed her eyes. She was 78 years old, and most mornings she woke before the sun, made a single cup of coffee in the percolator her husband Harold had bought in 1987, and sat at the kitchen table watching the light come up over the Fenton's maple tree next door. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration, but it was hers. Harold had worked 31 years at the Dayton assembly plant to pay it off, and when he died 6 years ago of a heart attack in the garden, Ruth had promised herself she would die in that house too, in her own bed, surrounded by the things that still smelled faintly of him if she pressed her face into his old flannel shirts in the closet. She did not have much family left to speak of. Her daughter Carol lived in Phoenix and called on Sundays, if she remembered, which was maybe 2 Sundays out of every 5. Her son, Michael, had not spoken to her in 11 years, not since an argument about money that Ruth still didn't fully understand the shape of. She had a sister in Cincinnati who was 91 and mostly asleep by 7 in the evening. So the neighborhood was, in most practical ways, Ruth's family now. The Fentons next door, the Nash family across the street, the Diaz kids who used to mow her lawn for $5 before they went off to college and stopped needing $5 from an old woman. The trouble had started 8 months earlier, though Ruth hadn't understood it as trouble at the time. A letter had come from a company called Heartland Municipal Recovery, informing her that her property taxes from 2 years prior were delinquent and that a tax lien had been sold. Ruth had called the county treasurer's office, confused because she had always paid her taxes. Harold had set up automatic payments before he died, and she had simply trusted that they continued. It turned out the bank account those payments drew from had been closed after a merger, and the automatic payments had silently failed for 18 months, while Ruth, unaware, believed everything was as it had always been. By the time she understood what was happening, the lien had already been purchased by Heartland, a company Ruth would later learn specialized in buying delinquent tax debt from counties at a discount and then aggressively pursuing homeowners, often elderly, often confused, often alone, for repayment with interest and fees that could triple the original debt within a year. Ruth had tried to pay what she owed. She had gone to the bank, withdrawn what savings she had, and mailed a check for the original tax amount. Heartland had returned it, uncashed, with a letter stating that the debt now included legal fees, processing fees, and interest that brought the total to nearly 4 times what Ruth had sent. She had gone to a legal aid clinic downtown, waited 3 hours in a folding chair, and spoken to a tired young man who told her that unfortunately, under Ohio's tax lien statutes, companies like Heartland had broad rights to pursue foreclosure once a certain threshold of unpaid interest accrued, and that she should have responded to the initial notice within 30 days. Ruth had not understood the initial notice. It had arrived during the week she was in the hospital for a hip procedure, and by the time she came home and read her mail, the clock, a clock she hadn't known existed, was already running out. She told no one. That was perhaps Ruth's greatest failing in this whole affair, though it was not really a failing so much as the quiet, stubborn pride of a woman who had spent her whole life not wanting to be a burden. She did not tell Barbara Nash across the street, who brought her tomatoes from her garden every August. She did not tell the Fentons, who she'd watched raise 3 children from infancy to adulthood over the fence line. She did not call her daughter in Phoenix, because Carol had her own troubles, a husband who'd lost his job the year before, and Ruth did not want to add to them. So the letters kept coming, and Ruth kept them in a shoebox in the hall closet, and she prayed, though not out loud, and not in any organized way, just a kind of low hum of hope that ran under her days, that somehow it would resolve itself, the way most bad things in her life eventually had, given enough patience. It did not resolve itself. On a grey Tuesday morning in early October, Ruth was in her kitchen washing the single coffee cup from breakfast when she heard a knock, and then, before she could dry her hands and reach the door, a second, harder knock, and then the sound of a key turning in her lock, a key she had never given anyone. She would later learn that Heartland Municipal Recovery had obtained a default judgment of foreclosure 3 weeks earlier. The notice of that judgment had been mailed to her house, but it had gone, through some clerical error or deliberate obscurity in the paperwork, to a P.O. box that had belonged to the house's previous owner in the 1990s and had never once belonged to Ruth. She had no idea a judgment existed. She had no idea, standing in her kitchen with dish soap still on her hands, that the men now walking through her front door, 2 large men in matching grey polo shirts, followed by a woman in a blazer holding a clipboard, had a legal right, however dubious in its origins, to remove her from the only home she had left in the world. "Mrs. Whitfield," the woman said, consulting her clipboard as though Ruth might be someone else entirely. "I'm Denise Coleman, Property Recovery Coordinator for Heartland. I'm sorry to inform you that as of this morning, this property has been reclaimed under Ohio Revised Code foreclosure provisions. You'll need to gather any essential personal items. My team will assist you." Ruth stood very still, the dish towel still in her hands, and for a long moment she could not make any words come out of her mouth at all. Outside, through her kitchen window, she could see Barbara Nash standing on her own porch across the street, phone pressed to her ear, already calling someone, though whether for help or simply to report what she was witnessing, Ruth would never be entirely sure. Wesley Callahan had ridden past Larkspur Lane at least 1,000 times in the 11 years he'd lived in this part of Dayton, though he'd never once stopped there, never had a reason to. He was 52 years old, built like a man who'd spent 2 decades working construction before his knees gave out, with a grey beard he kept trimmed close and forearms covered in tattoos that told the story of a life he didn't much like discussing. A stint in the army in the early 90s, a divorce that had cost him nearly everything, a period of drinking that he was not proud of, and 11 years sober from now, 1 day at a time, the way they taught him at the VA. These days, Wesley rode with the Iron Guardians, a motorcycle club that had a clubhouse 20 minutes from Larkspur Lane, and a reputation among people who didn't know better for being trouble. In truth, the Iron Guardians spent most of their weekends doing toy drives for the Children's Hospital and escorting funeral processions for fallen veterans. But Wesley had long ago stopped trying to correct the assumptions people made when they saw a man like him coming down the road on a black Harley-Davidson Road King, leather vest covered in patches, sunglasses hiding whatever was in his eyes. That Tuesday morning, he was riding to see his sponsor, a man named Frank Doyle, who'd been sober 19 years and still met Wesley for coffee every week, whether either of them needed it or not. And his route happened to take him down Larkspur Lane, past a little blue house he'd passed 1,000 times without really seeing. This time, he saw. There was a moving truck in the driveway, the kind rental companies used for evictions and foreclosures, and two men were carrying a recliner chair out to the curb, while a small, thin woman stood on her own front lawn in a housecoat, gripping the collar of her robe with both hands, as though she might fly apart if she let go. Wesley had seen this before. Not this house, not this woman, but this exact scene, more times than he wanted to remember, back when he'd done contract work for a property management company in his 30s and had, to his ongoing shame, once helped carry furniture out of a house belonging to an old man who'd cried the entire time and asked nobody in particular where he was supposed to go. Wesley slowed the bike. He told himself he was only slowing down because of the truck blocking half the lane, but even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. Something about the woman's face, a specific, particular kind of bewilderment, the look of someone watching her whole life get carried out to a curb in cardboard boxes, made him pull the Harley over onto the shoulder across the street and cut the engine. "Ma'am," he called out, walking his bike the last few feet before letting the kickstand down. "You need some help here?" The woman turned to look at him, and up close, Wesley could see she was older than he'd first thought, maybe closer to 80, with white hair pinned back and hands that trembled slightly at her sides. She looked at him, 6'2", leather vest, forearms full of ink, with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but some uncertain place between the two. "They're taking my house," she said, and her voice cracked in the middle of the word house, like it was too heavy a word to say all in one piece. I didn't know they were coming today. I didn't know." Wesley looked past her at the woman with the clipboard, who was directing the two movers toward a china cabinet visible through the open front door. He'd been around enough evictions, enough foreclosures, enough hard luck in his own life to recognize the particular choreography of it, the practiced indifference of people whose job was to not think too hard about what they were doing. "Ma'am, my name's Wesley," he said, keeping his voice low and even, the voice he used with skittish dogs and frightened people, which in his experience required roughly the same approach. "Do you have any paperwork? Any letter that told you this was happening today?" Ruth shook her head, and then, as if remembering, pointed a shaking finger toward the house. "There's a box. In my closet. I have letters. I didn't understand them. I tried to pay. I sent them a check." "Okay," Wesley said. "Okay, I'm going to call somebody, all right? Just stay right here with me a second." He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and called Frank Doyle, whose daughter, as it happened, was a paralegal at a small firm downtown that did pro bono housing work on the side. While the phone rang, Wesley watched Denise Coleman approach across the lawn, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Denise said. "This is a legal property recovery. Are you a family member?" "I'm a neighbor," Wesley said, which was not exactly true but felt true enough in the moment. "You got a court order? An eviction notice with a sheriff's signature on it?" Denise's expression flickered just slightly, in a way that told Wesley more than any document could have. "We have a default judgment of foreclosure. That's all that's legally required for property recovery under the lien." "That's a foreclosure judgment," Wesley said. "That's not the same as an eviction order. Where's your writ of restitution? Where's the sheriff?" He didn't know, with total legal certainty, that he was right. He'd learned what he knew about property law the hard way, second-hand, from years of watching people around him lose homes and apartments and everything else. But he knew enough to know that a company showing up with two men in polo shirts and no uniformed officer in sight was, at minimum, cutting a very sharp corner. Frank picked up on the fourth ring. "Wes, what's going on?" Frank, I need your girl. Right now, today, if she can. There's a lady here, they're pulling her out of her house, and I don't think it's being done right." Behind him, Ruth Whitfield had gone very quiet, watching the two men carry her kitchen table, the table where she and Harold had eaten 31,000 breakfasts together, give or take, out toward the curb, and set it down on the wet grass like it was nothing at all, like it wasn't the exact center of a life. Across the street, Barbara Nash stood on her porch, phone still to her ear, having called her husband to tell him what was happening rather than walking across the street to stand beside her neighbor of 20 years. She would think about that decision for a long time afterward, and not kindly. "Ma'am," Wesley said, turning back to Ruth, "I don't think they're allowed to do this the way they're doing it. I've got somebody making calls right now. But I need you to not sign anything, and I need you to not leave if you can help it. Can you do that?" Ruth Whitfield looked at this enormous, tattooed stranger who had stopped his motorcycle on a Tuesday morning to stand beside her, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight with fear for 8 months, loosened just slightly, just enough to let her breathe. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said quietly. "If I leave, I don't have anywhere to go." "Then we're not leaving," Wesley said, and he meant it more firmly than he'd meant almost anything in years. By noon, the movers had stopped carrying furniture, though not because anyone had told them to stop legally. Denise Coleman had simply made a phone call to her supervisor and then announced, with visible irritation, that they would pause operations pending clarification, which Wesley understood to mean that someone above her had gotten nervous once a call came in from an actual attorney's office rather than an old woman alone. The attorney was named Grace Sutton, a woman in her 30s who arrived 40 minutes after Frank's call in a modest grey sedan, wearing the kind of expression Wesley recognized from every good lawyer he'd ever met, the look of someone who was calm because she was furious, not despite it. She spent 20 minutes on the phone, standing on Ruth's lawn, pacing back and forth across grass that was at that moment still legally in dispute. And when she hung up, she was holding a legal pad covered in notes. "Mrs. Whitfield," Grace said, crouching slightly to be at eye level with Ruth, who had finally sat down on the wooden porch steps. "I want you to know that what happened here today should not have happened. The judgment they're operating under is real, but the notice requirements for an actual physical removal are much stricter than a foreclosure judgment alone. They needed a separate writ of restitution and a sheriff present. What they did today, sending a private company with no law enforcement, no proper notice of the removal date, that's a serious problem for them, not for you." "So I can stay?" Ruth asked, and Wesley heard in her voice the particular fragile hope of someone who has been disappointed too many times to trust good news without bracing for the other half of the sentence. "For today, yes," Grace said carefully. "I've already gotten Heartland's counsel to agree to pause any further action until we can get an emergency hearing, probably within the next 10 days. But Mrs. Whitfield, I have to be honest with you. The underlying debt is real. You do owe back taxes, and Heartland does hold a legitimate lien, even if the fees they've piled on top of it are almost certainly unconscionable and challengeable in court. This isn't over. Today was a bad move on their part, and it buys us time, but it doesn't make the debt disappear." Ruth nodded slowly, absorbing this the way she absorbed most difficult news these days, quietly, without complaint, filing it away next to the other burdens she carried without telling anyone. Wesley watched her do this and felt something tighten in his own chest, an old familiar anger that had nothing to do with Ruth Whitfield specifically and everything to do with every time in his own life he'd watched people with power grind down people without it, simply because the paperwork allowed it and nobody was standing close enough to say otherwise. Over the following week, Wesley found himself back on Larkspur Lane more days than not. He told himself it was because Ruth needed someone to help move her furniture back into the house, which was true, and because someone needed to fix the lock the eviction crew had drilled through, which was also true. But underneath those practical reasons was something less easy to name, a kind of pull he hadn't felt toward another person in a long time. Not since his marriage had ended 15 years earlier, and he'd more or less decided that his own capacity for that kind of attachment had burned out along with everything else. He brought Frank around one evening, and the two of them fixed the doorframe the movers had cracked, getting the china cabinet back through. Ruth insisted on making them dinner, a pot roast that took most of the afternoon, and served it on the same table that had sat abandoned on her wet lawn a week earlier. And for a few hours the house on Larkspur Lane felt, Wesley thought, less like a place under siege, and more like what it had probably felt like decades ago, full of noise and food and people who cared whether you'd eaten. But the legal fight was not going smoothly. Grace Sutton called on a Thursday to say that Heartland's attorneys were pushing back hard against any reduction of the fees, arguing that Ruth had received adequate notice under the letter of the law, even if the notice had gone to an outdated address, because, technically, the address had never been formally updated in county records after Harold's death, an administrative gap that was arguably Ruth's own failure, however unintentional. "They're going to argue she should have caught it," Grace told Wesley on the phone, her voice tight with the particular frustration of a lawyer who believed in a case but understood how the system might still fail it. "An 80-year-old widow managing property records alone. It's going to be an ugly hearing." Wesley found himself, in the days that followed, doing something he hadn't done in years, talking to people. He mentioned Ruth's situation at the clubhouse, and within days, half the Iron Guardians knew her name. He mentioned it to Frank's daughter, who mentioned it to a reporter she knew at the local news station, who came out and did a short segment about elderly residents being targeted by aggressive tax-lien companies using Ruth's story, with her permission, her face soft and dignified on camera, her voice steadier than Wesley had heard it yet, as the anchor of the piece. The news segment brought calls. Other families in the area, it turned out, had similar stories. An elderly man on the east side who'd lost his home the year before under nearly identical circumstances. A widow in Kettering who was 3 months into a similar nightmare with the same company. Grace Sutton began building what she called a pattern of practice case, evidence that Heartland Municipal Recovery routinely exploited administrative gaps and outdated addresses to push foreclosures through, with minimal actual notice to the homeowners it targeted. Wesley, for his part, found something shifting in himself that he hadn't expected. He had spent years since his divorce, keeping people at a careful, manageable distance, showing up for his sobriety meetings, riding with the club, doing the occasional good deed at arm's length, but never really letting anyone close enough to need him, because needing and being needed had in his experience mostly ended in loss. Ruth Whitfield needed him, plainly and without pretense, and instead of the old instinct to retreat, Wesley found himself leaning in. "You remind me of my mother," Ruth told him one evening, the two of them sitting on her porch steps while the sun went down over the Fenton's maple tree, now bare with November approaching. "Not in looks. In the way you just decided to help. She used to say that was the whole measure of a person, what they did when nobody was making them do anything." "I didn't do much," Wesley said. "Made a phone call." "You stopped," Ruth said. "Everyone else on this street just watched. You stopped." Wesley didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't try to give one. He just sat with her a while longer, watching the last of the light go down over Larkspur Lane. Both of them quiet in a way that felt, for the first time in a long while for each of them, less like loneliness and more like company. But 3 days before the emergency hearing, Grace Sutton called with news that put a knot in Wesley's stomach. Heartland's attorneys had filed a motion to expedite, arguing that further delay caused them ongoing financial harm, and the judge, a man known locally for favoring efficiency over sentiment, had granted it. The hearing was moved up. They would have 5 fewer days to prepare than they'd planned on, 5 fewer days to gather the pattern of practice evidence Grace believed could make the difference between Ruth losing her home for good and Ruth getting to keep it. "We're not ready," Grace admitted late on a Tuesday call, exhaustion audible under her professional calm. "We might have enough. We might not." Wesley looked over at Ruth, asleep now on her recliner in front of the television, her hands folded in her lap the way she always sat, and felt the old anger rise in him again, sharper this time, mixed now with something that scared him more than anger ever had, the fear of losing something, someone he had only just started to let himself care about. The Montgomery County Courthouse was a squat brick building downtown that Wesley had been inside exactly twice before in his life, once for a traffic citation in his 20s, once many years later for his divorce. And both times he had left feeling smaller than when he'd walked in. This time, he told himself, would be different, though as he sat on the hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4B beside Ruth, who was wearing her one good dress and gripping a rosary her mother had given her 70 years earlier, even though she rarely prayed with it anymore, he felt the same old smallness creeping back in anyway. Grace Sutton arrived with a rolling case full of documents, her face composed but her knuckles pale where she gripped the handle. Behind her came Frank's daughter Melissa, the paralegal, and behind them, unexpectedly, 6 members of the Iron Guardians in their leather vests, having heard through the clubhouse grapevine that today was the day, and having decided, without much discussion, that Ruth Whitfield should not sit in that courtroom without a crowd behind her. "You didn't have to do that," Wesley murmured to Frank, who shrugged. "Wasn't my idea. Fellas decided on their own. Word travels." Also present, seated a few rows back and looking uncomfortable in a blazer that didn't quite fit right, was Barbara Nash, Ruth's neighbor from across the street. She had approached Ruth in the courthouse hallway that morning, awkward and apologetic, and asked if she could come sit with her. "I should have come over that day," Barbara had said, unable to quite meet Ruth's eyes. "I called my husband instead of just walking across the street. I felt sick about it for weeks." Ruth had taken her hand and said only, "You're here now," which was, Wesley thought, a more generous response than most people would have managed. The hearing began at 10 in the morning. Heartland's attorney, a sharp young man named Corbin Reyes, no relation, Wesley noted absently, to any of the assumptions Heartland's own aggressive tactics might have encouraged, laid out the company's position with clinical precision: a valid tax lien, a valid default judgment, notice sent to the address of record, and a homeowner who had failed, over 18 months, to update that address or respond to any of the notices sent. "My client followed the letter of the law at every step," Reyes said. "We understand this is emotionally difficult for Mrs. Whitfield, but sympathy is not a legal defense to a valid debt." Grace Sutton stood when it was her turn, and Wesley watched her set her notes down on the table rather than pick them up, choosing instead to speak plainly, without the shield of paper between her and the judge. "Your Honor, my client is 78 years old. She paid her property taxes faithfully for over 40 years until an automatic payment system failed due to no fault of her own, following a bank merger she was never notified about. When she discovered the error, she attempted to pay the original tax amount in full. Heartland refused that payment and instead pursued a debt that had, by that point, tripled through fees and interest that this court should scrutinize closely for their reasonableness. She walked the judge through the pattern of practice evidence, 5 other cases in the county over the past 2 years, all involving elderly homeowners, all involving notices sent to outdated addresses that a basic records check would have corrected, all resulting in aggressive default judgments pursued with unusual speed. 2 of the other affected homeowners, it turned out, had come forward after seeing the news segment about Ruth, and Grace had sworn affidavits from both. "This is not one unfortunate administrative gap, Your Honor," Grace said. "This is a business model. Heartland Municipal Recovery has built a practice around finding exactly this kind of gap: an elderly homeowner, an outdated address, a payment system quietly failing in the background, and moving as fast as possible before anyone notices enough to object. Mrs. Whitfield tried to pay her debt. She was refused. The only reason she's not homeless today is that a stranger happened to be riding past her house on the one morning Heartland chose to send an unmarked crew with no sheriff and no proper writ to physically remove her. The judge, a heavy-set man named Judge Abernathy, who had a reputation for moving through his docket with brisk efficiency and little patience for theatrics, looked over his glasses first at Grace, then at Reyes, then, for a long moment, at Ruth Whitfield herself, sitting very still and very small in the third row, her hands folded around her mother's rosary. "Mrs. Whitfield," the judge said, "is there anything you'd like to say?" Ruth had not planned to speak. Grace had told her she likely wouldn't need to, that the legal arguments would carry the day, or they wouldn't, and Ruth's own testimony was mostly a formality. But when the judge asked, something in Ruth stood up inside her even before her body did, and she rose slowly from the bench, one hand still holding the rosary, and spoke in a voice that shook only slightly. "Your Honor, I'm not a woman who's ever asked anybody for anything I didn't earn. My husband worked 31 years so we could own that house outright, and I have tried every single day since he passed to take care of it the way he would have wanted. When I found out about the mistake with the taxes, I sent them a check for exactly what I owed, because that's what you do. You pay what you owe. They sent it back. I didn't understand the letters that came after that. I'm not ashamed to say that. I'm 78 years old, and the world moves faster now than I can always keep up with, and I think there are companies out there who count on that, who count on people like me not understanding fast enough, not moving fast enough to stop them from taking what isn't rightfully theirs to take." She paused, and in the silence that followed, Wesley watched half the Iron Guardians behind him sit up a little straighter, watched Barbara Nash wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. "That house is the only place my husband still lives. In any way I can still reach him," Ruth said. "I would like to die there, Your Honor, the way I always planned to. I'm asking you not to let that be taken from me over a mistake I made trying to trust that the world would treat me fairly." The courtroom was quiet for a long moment after she sat back down. Judge Abernathy removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at the documents in front of him for what felt to Wesley like an unbearably long time. The judge did not rule that day. He told both parties he would issue a written decision within 2 weeks, which Grace Sutton warned Wesley, and Ruth was actually a good sign. A quick ruling against Ruth would have been easy to issue from the bench, but a judge taking time usually meant he was wrestling seriously with the pattern of practice evidence, weighing something more than the narrow question of notice and deadlines. The 2 weeks that followed were, in their own way, harder than the hearing itself. Ruth tried to return to her ordinary routines, the coffee at dawn, the crossword puzzle, the evening news. But the not knowing sat over the house on Larkspur Lane like weather, a low-pressure system that never quite broke. Wesley came by most days, sometimes with Frank, sometimes alone, and the two of them fell into an easy rhythm of small repairs and smaller conversations, the kind of quiet companionship that neither of them had expected to find at this stage of their lives, but that both, privately, had come to depend on. "What happens if he rules against me?" Ruth asked one evening, not for the first time, and Wesley had learned by now not to offer false comfort, only honest company. "Then we appeal," he said. "And if that doesn't work, we figure out the next thing. You're not doing any of this alone anymore, Ruth. That part isn't up for negotiation." She had looked at him for a long moment, the porch light throwing soft shadows across her face, and said, "I don't know what I did to deserve a friend like you, showing up the way you did." "You didn't do anything," Wesley said. "That's sort of the point. Some things you don't earn. Somebody just decides to stay." He thought, saying it of his own life. The drinking years, the divorce, the slow retreat into a kind of careful isolation he'd told himself was peace, but which he now understood, with the clarity that only comes in hindsight, had mostly just been fear dressed up as independence. Ruth Whitfield had not asked him to fix anything in himself. She had simply needed a neighbor to stop, and in stopping, Wesley had found something he hadn't known he was looking for, a reason, ordinary and unglamorous, to keep showing up. The ruling came on a Thursday morning, delivered by email to Grace Sutton's office, and she drove straight to Larkspur Lane rather than call, wanting, she said later, to be there in person for whichever way it went. Wesley was already at the house, replacing a cracked window pane in the kitchen, when Grace's car pulled into the driveway, and something in the set of her shoulders as she walked up the path told him the answer before she said a word. "He ruled for us," Grace said, and Ruth, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, nearly the same posture she'd been in the morning this all began, made a small sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, some sound that lived in the space between the two. The judge's written opinion was thorough. He found that Heartland's pattern of practice evidence was compelling enough to warrant setting aside the default judgment entirely, ruling that the notice provided to Ruth had been constitutionally inadequate given the company's documented history of exploiting outdated address records. He ordered Heartland to accept Ruth's original tax payment in full, with only reasonable statutory interest, and to pay Ruth's legal fees as a sanction for what he described in his opinion as a troubling and apparently deliberate business practice targeting vulnerable homeowners. He further referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of whether Heartland's practices, replicated across the cases Grace had documented, rose to the level of a pattern warranting broader investigation. It was, Grace told them, about as complete a victory as they could have hoped for. There was a small gathering on Larkspur Lane that Saturday, not a party exactly. Ruth wasn't the type for parties, but something like one, with Frank and several of the Iron Guardians bringing folding chairs and a grill out into Ruth's front yard, and Barbara Nash contributing a casserole, and the Fentons from next door finally coming over to properly meet the woman they'd lived beside for 2 decades without ever really knowing. Wesley stood near the grill, flipping burgers with a spatula that looked comically small in his large hands, and watched Ruth move through her own yard, laughing at something Frank had said, more at ease than Wesley had seen her in the 2 months since he'd first stopped his motorcycle across the street. "You did a good thing," Frank said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "We did a good thing," Wesley corrected. "No," Frank said. "You stopped. Everybody else on this street drove right on by for 8 months. You stopped." Wesley thought about that for a while, watching the smoke rise off the grill into the cool November air. He thought about all the years he'd spent believing that the safest way to live was to keep his distance, to help where it was easy and convenient and didn't ask too much of him, and never to let himself need anyone or be needed too deeply in return. He thought about how wrong that had turned out to be, and how strange it was that it had taken an 80-year-old woman crying on her own front lawn to teach him something he probably should have learned decades earlier. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home and the yard had gone quiet again, Ruth found Wesley sitting alone on her porch steps, looking out at the street in the fading light. "I have something for you," she said, and pressed a small object into his palm, a pocket watch, gold-plated and worn smooth at the edges, the kind of thing a man might have carried in the 1950s. "This was Harold's," Ruth said. "His father gave it to him, and he always said he'd have given it to Michael if things had gone differently between them. I don't know if Michael will ever want it, but I know Harold would have liked the idea of it belonging to somebody who showed up the way you did. Somebody who stopped." Wesley turned the watch over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the small, particular history it carried. "I can't take this, Ruth." "You can," she said, settling onto the step beside him with the careful slowness of her 78 years. "It's mine to give, and I'm giving it to you. That's how this works. Somebody gives you something freely, because they want to, and you say thank you, and you carry it forward." They sat together for a while longer as the streetlights came on along Larkspur Lane, two people who had not known each other 2 months earlier and who now, improbably, could not quite imagine their lives without the other in them. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and a porch light clicked on, and the ordinary evening sounds of the neighborhood continued around them, unremarkable and precious in the way that ordinary things become precious only after you've nearly lost them. "I'm not going anywhere," Wesley said finally, and Ruth, looking out at the street she had called home for 46 years, and would now, at last, call home for as long as she wanted, simply nodded and reached over and took his hand.